Okay, guys, this is going to be practical number 2, the skull. So let's get right to it. To find the foci, the major foci inside the top of the skull, you're going to have to take the cap off. So when we start talking about the foci, or each fossa, we have the anterior fossa. It's this whole area up in here. The middle foci, or fossa, excuse me, is going to be this right here. And of course, the posterior is going to be inside of the back of the skull. And you can see I'm giving you a little perspective here. All right, so let's talk about the next thing, which is the frontal bone. That's pretty obvious. The frontal bone is obviously this bone in the front. We've already done that with the full skeleton. The supraorbital margin above the eyes. So this would be where your eyebrows would be, and this is why they protect your eyes, because you have this little prominence here. This is your supraorbital margin. And you also have supraorbital foramen. Those are little holes. There's one right here and one right here. The parietal bone's pretty easy. I'm just going to look at the cap here. The parietal bone, this is from the back side or the posterior side. The parietal bones are these two bones at the top of the skull. The sphenoid bone, you're going to have to look inside the skull, the top of the skull. The sphenoid bone itself is this whole, actually it's the whole middle foci, and it includes this area right here. In here, you will see this is the sella turcica. This is where your pituitary gland sits. You also have optic foramen, that's here and here. And then you have foramen rotunda, which is here. I'm not going in order on your paper. So this is foramen rotundum. This is foramen ovale. And this little guy here is foramen spinosum. Okay, don't worry about this one right here. So, rotundum, ovale, spinosum. So now we're going to the second page of this. So we're going to go to the temporal bone, which is the side here. I have it cut off. I took the cap off. I don't really want to take 1,000 minutes to do this. So this is all part of the temporal bone. This process right here, it's a little lump here under your ear, in the back of your ear, excuse me. This is the mastoid process. This kind of canal right here would be the external auditory meatus. It's not meatus, it's meatus. You have the zygomatic process, which is part of your cheekbone. Okay. Then you have your mandibular fossa. So where your mandible comes in, and I have it upside down now, where the mandible comes into and articulates with the jaw, and this is obviously not there all the time. There is a fossa or a divot where your mandibles articulate with your skull. Okay. The styloid process, I think I told you a stylus is a pen or some kind of writing utensil. These are the styloid process. And remember, these are still all part of the temporal bone. Okay. The internal acoustic meatus is going to be a continuation of the external auditory meatus. That is going to be right here on this side. That's the right. And over here on the left side. So it doesn't matter if you don't have to show me both, just show me one. The occipital bone is the rear bone. That's going to be this backbone here, not backbone, but the bone in the rear of the head. It includes some of the cap that I just took off and all the way under here. So part of the occipital bone, we have foramen magnum. That means big hole. This is where your spinal cord is going to be. The occipital condyles, we have to flip it over. And here we have two nice, smooth, articular surfaces. This is where the first cervical vertebra, or the atlas, is going to sit. This is where your head's going to sit on top of your spinal column. And we have the external occipital protuberance is right here. Okay. The ethmoid bone. This is actually partially inside of your eye. So you will point to, this is lacrimal. Back here would be the ethmoid bone, this little bone, and it actually continues up into this right here, which is inside of the skull. This is your cribriform plate. Okay. The palatine bone. This is your hard palate. So this is your maxilla, the top. I don't know if we talk. Yep, there's the maxilla. So where your teeth are, the top of your mouth, you can actually feel where this ends in the back of your mouth. Don't do it right now, but this is your palatine bone. The mandible, which is not attached to this. Okay, here's the lower jaw. The mandible has the mandibular condyles. These are going to articulate with the mandibular foci on the temporal bone. Okay. Mental foramen are going to be these holes right here and here. Those are going to allow blood vessels and nerves to enter. The angle of the mandible, obviously, that would be right here. Their intermaxillary suture, it's not easy to see, but right here where the, that's up here on the maxilla. So this should not actually be under mandible. This should be up here. This is the intermaxillary suture. This is the maxilla. This is the mandible. The mental protuberance, that's what I was pointing to before. This is kind of where your chin sticks out, okay? Again, the maxilla is the top of the jaw. The nasal bone is this bone right here, entire bone. The zygomatic bone, this is different than the process. This is the process. The bone is your cheekbone right here. This just leads to the back of your, towards the back of your skull. This main portion right here is your zygomatic bone. The lacrimal bone is inside of the eye, almost inside of the eye. There's a little hole. That's the lacrimal, where the lacrimal duct would have tears coming out of your eyes. So right in here would be your lacrimal bone. The inferior nasal conchae, you can see if you look inside of his nose or her nose that they have two sets of kind of protuberances coming out of the nose. You only need to know the inferior ones. That would be over here and over here. The vomer bone is actually the bone that goes down the middle of the nose right here. Okay. Most of your nose is cartilage. Sutures. When we talk about the sutures, those are those little squiggly lines on the top of the skull. So let's start with the squamous suture, and they actually differentiate or separate the different skull plates. So right here we have one squamous suture, and that's going to outline the temporal bones on each side of the head. We have the coronal suture, which is this one that goes from the left ear to the right ear. Almost, not quite, but it separates into a front and a back. So this is the coronal suture. The lambdoidal suture outlines the occipital bone, separates it from the two parietal bones. And this one right here is the sagittal suture. Now, with regards to these fontanelles, when we talk about a fontanelle, we're talking about a fetal skull. When you are born, I think I've told you before, your skeleton is made of hyaline cartilage. And also, you have plenty of room for your brain and skull to grow. You don't want to pop out of mom with a brain and skull this size. So these fontanelles are soft spots that allow for the growth of your brain and your skull. After you hit adulthood, or after puberty, these will close up as the sutures. So we have to use the regular skull because we don't have fetal skulls to do this. So the frontal or anterior fontanelle would be where in the front here where the sagittal suture meets the coronal suture. That's the frontal fontanelle. The occipital fontanelle would be where the sagittal suture meets the lambdoidal suture. So this area would also be a soft spot or fontanelle. Turning the skull to the side, oh man, I didn't want that to happen, but it did. The sphenoid fontanelle is where the coronal suture will meet up with the squamous suture on the side here. This is also part of the sphenoid bone, the further down you go. So right here would be another soft spot on both sides of the skull, obviously. And then we have the mastoid fontanelle, where the lambdoidal suture is going to meet up with the squamous suture right here. So this would be the mastoid fontanelle. Also, here's the mastoid process, so that should help you with that. And that is the skull. Thanks, guys.